Yesterday, I came across an MSN news report that North London Council, I can't recall off the top of my head which one it was, but North London Council had voted to twin itself with a city in Palestine, presumably in Gaza. And apparently, this had caused controversy from some Jewish groups who argued it was divisive. Um, I replied that what was controversial was the fact that Israel is acting with impunity and killing civilians every single day. Now, the response to that was I also pointed out, incidentally, that the council had voted to twin itself with the city, Hamas. Um, anyway, I got reactions to that, and not really surprisingly, I got 57 likes and 219 thumbs down. I'm candid about that because what I expected. Um, as I said in my last video, YouGov studies have shown that there's divided opinions on the conflict between Israel and Gaza in the UK. Certainly, Israel has lost support, but and there's slightly more support towards the Palestinians. But what the studies show is that neither the Palestinians or the Israelis have particularly enthusiastic support in the UK. Um, that having been said, I do think that there is unquestionably a pro-Israel bias in this country. I'm not just talking politically. I think it's actually in a big segment of our press, and to some extent in the public, less than it was. But I think, unfortunately, a lot of people look at this issue as very black and white. They think we're pro-Israel because Hamas is a terrorist organization. Israel is taking on the terrorist organization. So they oversimplify the situation. Um, I've got increasingly uncomfortable, if I'm being honest, with the dehumanizing attitude towards Palestinians. Now, what I mean by that is I think too many people seem to think the Palestinians are just expendable. And just to be very clear, I think that includes Hamas, because when they decided to attack Israel, when they did, it was an incredibly reckless move. They must have known, even if they don't care about their own people, they must have known that Israel would hit back hard and kill a lot of their militants. They must have known that. So, in terms of a military strategy, leaving aside all moral arguments, purely in terms of military strategy, yes, it hit Israel hard. Yes, it took Israel unawares, but um, I don't know if Hamas is thinking long term that they, wouldn't put it past them to incite a war in order for Israel to hit back and then, be even more polarized in the region. If that's the case, and it's kind of worked, Hamas has not been destroyed. Even if thousands of the fighters have been killed, it hasn't been destroyed. I don't know if it can be totally destroyed. Now, it didn't get much attention, but there was one big breakthrough this week, which is a cause to celebrate, actually. There isn't much in the world at the moment, but the PKK in Turkey has voted to disband itself, basically, thus ending a war that's been going on for 46 years and caused tens of thousands of deaths. That's something to celebrate. The end of any war, a genuine end to any war, is always something to celebrate. Um, Now, in the case of Gaza, there has been proposals that Hamas would voluntarily step down from its leadership position in exchange for aid and Israel stopping its airstrikes. I'd like to be optimistic and hope that goes ahead, but frankly, there's hardliners on both sides. On one hand, you have Hamas, which has an absolutely, they do have a genocidal manifesto towards the state of Israel. But there's also Israeli hardliners who I would argue some of them have a genocidal agenda towards the Palestinians. When you have hardliners on both sides, this is no longer the days of Sheikh Rabin and other peacemakers. This is a time of warmongers, unfortunately. And it's civilians who are paying the heaviest price, overwhelmingly Palestinian civilians. Um, One of the shocking things about October the 7th was the extent of casualties. It was unprecedented in modern Israel, and it was a very rare occasion where the number of Israeli casualties um, exceeded those of Palestinians. But it wasn't long before that went back to the way it was before, where the Palestinian casualties have far, far outweighed the Israeli casualties. And this isn't a point about, weighing up lives again, Israeli civilians versus Palestinian civilians. But the point is, there has been a massive civilian toll. Now, like I say, I think too many people in the British public take this attitude. They support Israel solely because, well, Israel's taken on a terrorist organization, and culturally, we're probably a bit closer to Israel than the Palestinians. Um, Although Israel's Jewish, it also has Christian minority. Um, I think Israeli society, despite what it's doing right now, probably is still more democratic than you would get in a lot of the Arab states. The fact that there's been protests against Netanyahu proves that. Um, and, we also associate, when we think of Palestinians, we think of Hamas, an Islamist group. Islamism is a threat to this country. I will say this, I think that some of the pro-Palestinian groups have done themselves no favours. I think coming out after October the 7th and gloating about it, praising Hamas was boneheaded. But I believe that everyone who is in pro-Palestinian marches is anti-Semitic. Absolutely not. Indeed, there's Jewish people on those marches. But I think there's a sufficient amount of anti-Semitism to be a problem. I think there's a sufficient amount of people who are sympathetic to Hamas to be very bad optics. I don't think they've done themselves any favors, and sometimes it has went into violence. Yesterday, the Nakba protests in Berlin ended up in violence. And I remember early on one of the demonstrations in Sydney, there was a lone Jewish man kind of surrounded by the mob. Now, that sort of thing absolutely doesn't do the Palestinian side any good in terms of PR. Having said that, I do think that anti-Semitism has been weaponized by right-wing Zionists. I believe that. I think they have used it as a way to silence criticism of Israel, legitimate criticism. But there's been a lot of things going on that I have called out, I've criticised. I think it was a disgrace, for example, that people putting up photos of their loved ones who'd been kidnapped by Hamas were advised to bring it down. That sort of thing was a disgrace. And I think there has been examples of anti-Semitism. There was a Jewish boy going to synagogue, was pelted with stones. Um, there has been examples of that. It's appalling. But frankly, there has also been dehumanizing attitudes the other way. I've seen people make disgusting jokes, so-called jokes, about the bombing of Gaza, um, and treating it like some sort of game. And the reason I've lost sympathy for Israel is because what it's doing is absolutely morally unjustified. Bombing hospitals, deliberately stopping aid getting in, bombing schools. At some point, you have to think, how much can there just be a blind check to do this? How much can there just be a blank slate to say Israel could do whatever it wants as long as it says it's tackling terrorism? That can be used as an excuse for anything, quite frankly. Um, I think what we're seeing, I mean, if we look at the way some of the press in this country has handled it, the Daily Telegraph stands out, but certainly the Daily Express, the Sun, the Daily Mail, and to a lesser extent the Times. The thing is, a lot of those publications, the Times, the Mail, the Daily Telegraph, have been pretty good in investigative journalism. It was the Daily Mail that uncovered that case of the miscarriage of justice. But it has to be said, when it comes to Israel and the Palestinians, they have a serious blind spot. They are so biased towards Israel, they don't even try to hide it. It's just as, I mean, I saw a report from, it was one of the tabloids, I can't remember off the top of my head. I just mentioned Israel may have taken out another Hamas commander. Absolutely zero mention of the fact that scores of civilians have been killed. Now, on this point about civilian casualties, people would say, oh, but you can't trust Hamas, it's their figures. But here's the thing, it isn't just Hamas figures. There is substantial evidence of a very heavy civilian toll. I'm not going to put an exact figure on it from reputable groups like The Lancet. We're talking about third parties, independent third parties here. This isn't just Hamas sources. In fact, it's quite plausible that the true toll is even higher. It's been reported at about 52,000. It may be even higher. Now, let's say a lot of that is Hamas fighters. That still means that there's a hell of a lot of civilians being killed. I don't know how anyone with a straight face can say that, a bomb falls on a hospital and there isn't going to be civilian casualties. I don't know how anyone could look at the images that we're seeing and say that a 5-year-old child is a Hamas fighter. It's frankly sickening that this is happening every single day, and there's people in this country who seem to think it's just fine. I do believe that support for Israel is damaging this country internationally. Now, I have no time for people who, like I've said before, that feign sympathy for the Palestinians, but then, or maybe they genuinely are sympathetic to the Palestinians, but then in the same breath they defend Putin. Um, but it works the other way, where people will be sympathetic to Ukrainian civilians, but then be okay with Israel killing Palestinians. I just don't understand this cherry picking of human rights. If you're against some killing of civilians, that should be across the board. And of course, there's other conflicts in the world that get scant attention. Burkina Faso, hundreds have been killed. And Somalia, the DRC, Myanmar. Um, but as it is, what's happening between Israel and Gaza is a very divisive, talked about conflict. And so long as it is, I I have to be honest, I've changed my stance. I went from being quite pro Israel to being right now, frankly, quite anti Israeli policy. I'm not anti Israel in the sense that I don't call for, I think any sort of starting point of expecting the state of Israel to be removed is nonsense. It won't happen. I don't go along with from the river to the sea. Israel is not going anywhere. But I think that at some point, there has to be a realization that this is just going too far. At some point, there has to be a realization that, eh, saying it isn't genocide comes across almost like semantics, because it's hard not to describe it any other way at this point. There's lots of legal ramifications as to what is the definition of genocide. I've heard people say if Israel wants to do this, they could take out Gaza tomorrow, and they probably could. But that's missing the point. Not all genocides happen overnight. Often they're a prolonged process. And if you look at some of the attitudes of the hardliners in Netanyahu's cabinet, coupled with the enabling of Donald Trump, talking about turning Gaza into real estate, at the very least, it's ethnic cleansing. I mean, I think it's repulsive what is being proposed. Um, that goes well, well beyond self-defense. I honestly believe if Israel took out every Hamas commander, they would still find a reason to bomb the Gaza Strip, because I don't believe that Netanyahu's government wants peace. I think it's a government of hardliners, ultra Zionists who just want absolutely to eliminate Gaza off the face of the earth. I believe that's what they want to do. And it's true that Hamas has a genocidal policy towards Israelis, but frankly, Netanyahu's cabinet has a genocidal policy, or it's hard to see it otherwise, towards the Gaza Strip. How else do you describe daily bombing where scores and scores of civilians are being killed? 100 one day, 60 the next. This is happening every single day. So I wouldn't be surprised if the casualty figures are being underreported. And like I say, this isn't just coming from Hamas sources. If it was, I would agree you should be somewhat cautious with that. But the camera doesn't lie, and independent sources have to be taken with some weight, I think. Um, I think at this point, definitely the government should cut off all arms to Israel. It won't do that because, frankly, Starmer is far too cautious on too many issues. If he did, if David Lammy and Keir Starmer announced that they were cutting off all arms tomorrow, they already done this partially, but if they'd done it completely, of course there would be a right wing backlash from the likes of Reform, the Tories, all the right wing publications. But, Sometimes governments have to take risks, and sometimes governments have to risk being unpopular or inciting controversy. And this may be one of those occasions. And Israel, of course, will be furious about it. But without American support, I don't think Israel will be able to do what it's doing. And that's another point. If we decide to take a policy like that, and there is increasing pressure on Labour to do that, Trump will mouth off and say this will affect British American relations. We shouldn't have our foreign policy dictated by Washington. We're a sovereign nation. We should determine that on our own. Other European nations have already done this. Spain, Ireland, numerous other countries. I think at this point it's only Britain and Germany that still arm Israel within Europe. I think there's been a pause in other countries. I think France has made a pause at the moment. But regardless, Israel has unquestionably lost support since October the 7th. By continuing to support Israel, I think this country is, I think we're damaging our international reputation. And it does make it a bit hard when this country then criticizes the likes of Russia killing civilians. And I believe I don't want to be misunderstood here. I think we're justified in criticizing Russia, but I do think it leaves us open to charges of hypocrisy. Now, that doesn't exonerate Putin. I will continue condemning Putin. I think the Prime Minister's right to condemn Putin, but it is definitely something that's going to leave us open to charges of hypocrisy, especially in Arab countries. And it's hard to argue against that. Um, this cannot go on. How many more civilians are going to just be sacrificed under the guise of Israel defending itself? How much is Israel going to get a green light to do as it pleases? Every country has a right to defend itself, but that doesn't mean it has a right to commit war crimes. It doesn't mean it has a right to bomb hospitals, withhold aid, and massacre civilians every single day. There's no other expression for it. You could use semantics and say it's collateral damage, which I think is a ghastly term, but this is happening every single day, and it sits very unwell with me. So I'll just round this off. I think that the reason the Palestinian camp hasn't got much support is some of their tactics haven't been very sensible. For example, um, talking about protesting on Armistice Day was not a very sensible move. I think there is a perception that a lot of pro-Palestinians are, by extension, anti-West, and I think some of them are. If some of those protest organisers could make it clear that they're not anti-Britain, okay, they could be against this government arming Israel, but I think the problem is they haven't done a good job of dissuading the perception that they are pro Hamas. They claim that they're not, but frankly, some of them are. That's why, even though I feel the way I do, I'm not in a rush to join any of those demonstrations. I'm not going to buy a little Palestinian pin anytime soon because, whilst I have huge sympathy for the Palestinian people, as it stands, Hamas is running Gaza. So I think if they were to step down, that would be a huge move toward peace. If they genuinely care about the Palestinian people, they will do that. If they don't, it shows that they're selfish and it shows what a lot of people perceive that they're more of a problem than the solution. I think Netanyahu's government is absolutely, unquestionably going too far. I don't know how people could say this is justifiable. Even if you have five Hamas gunmen in a hospital, does that justify flattening that hospital and killing 100 civilians in the protest, or a refugee camp, or a school? It's If you believe that the killing of civilians is wrong, I don't see how you can cherry pick. I don't see how you could say, well, it's wrong, but we'll give Israel a free rein to do it. I think what Israel's doing right now is morally indefensible. Um, and on the point about anti Semitism, I will always condemn clear examples of anti Semitism, but I will personally not be silenced by any hard right pro Israeli who wants to weaponize that term to silence criticism of Israel. Um, I think that's disgraceful. I think that's an insult to victims of the Holocaust, actually, to hijack the concept of anti Semitism, silent criticism of Israel, particularly when late Holocaust survivors have themselves criticized it. Um, And many Jewish people have condemned Israel. There's groups like the Jewish Voices for Peace, Jewish Voice for Peace, um, and others who I think well, one of the biggest problems with coverage of this conflict is Jewish voices against Israel have been completely ignored. You know, it's this perception that all Jewish people are fiercely pro-Israel or they're right-wing Zionists. That is not true. One of the dumb things about that Hamas assault, apart from being morally indefensible, apart from being a brutal terrorist attack, was that the people they attacked were in left-leaning kibbutzes that probably would have been anti-Netanyahu. Ironically, it's the very people who probably would have been sympathetic to the Palestinians that they attacked. The conditions they've been held in is appalling. I have enormous sympathy for the hostages. You know, it's going to take years for them to rebuild their lives when they are released. Imagine being trapped in those tunnels in dark, being fed scant portions, being degraded. It is appalling. It is a crime against humanity. Um, but so is what Israel is doing right now with its aerial bombardment, with its absolutely relentless onslaught against Palestinian civilians. And I'm just sick and tired of the idea that I think, frankly, it's hard not to conclude that there's a bit of a racist attitude to the idea that Palestinians are expendable. I am convinced if this was the other way around and we were talking about 52,000 Israelis killed, there would be very, very different attitudes. And it's hard not to consider those double standards. Um, what can I do? I have signed a petition calling for this government to stop arms to Israel. And you know the right are very good at arguing their case. They're very they'll always find ways to try and defend this, but in the end it's indefensible. If we cut off arms to Israel, it wouldn't stop the killing. America will still arm Israel, but I think it's still politically significant. And I think Starmer and Lamy can do this, and they must. I hope that pressure increases from Labour backbenchers because recently, even some Tories have come out and condemned Israel, and that's saying something. I just think that this country is going to be seen as complicit, even if what we offer and support is a tiny fraction of what America does. It still harms our international reputation. I think the Prime Minister has to do more than just cut off arms. I think this government has to vocally criticise Israel's killing of civilians, not just express caution or urge restraint. Israel isn't showing any restraint. It's time to outright condemn Israel and let them have a tantrum, let them lash back. Israel hasn't thought twice about killing British civilians in the past. Some of the aid workers who were killed in the World Food Kitchen were British civilians. Israel lied about that. And there's another point with this. I'm going to round up with this. Yeah, it's all very well saying we don't trust Hamas sources. Fine. I don't entirely trust Hamas either, although there is third party corroboration to civilian casualties. But why is it people just assume that Israeli sources are telling the truth? Why is it they just assume? And this is another failure of journalism. When the likes of the Daily Telegraph and the Daily Mail just lap up Israeli sources as the gospel truth. That is a failure of journalism. And, you know, for papers that have got a proud record of investigative journalism, it's lazy. It's bad journalism. They're just taking Israeli sources at face value. Why? Ostensibly because Israel's an ally. I don't think it's much of an ally, quite frankly. I think everything Israel does is self-interested, is for self-interest. I'll wrap this up, but that's my stance. Have I went 360? Not necessarily, because if I'd gone 360, I'd have no sympathy for Israel whatsoever. I have sympathy for Israeli hostages. I have no sympathy for Hamas. Um, and I still say Israel has a right to defense. And what I do say, Israel's went too far. And it's used that right to self-defense to justify something else. Um, because let's not forget, every genocide in history has had some sort of excuse behind it. Um, And that's what we're seeing now. The excuse Israel's using is it's all for self defense. We're wiping out entire families, but hey, it's self defense, that's fine. That's what we're seeing, and I think it's morally unsustainable. Let me know your thoughts.